How's it going, guys? If you clicked on this video, it means that you're interested in learning about photography. Well, I'm gonna teach you the basics. Well, at least where you can start. So the basics to photography start with 3 key elements, and they make up your exposure triangle. So the 3 key elements that you need to know are shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. And you might ask, what are those things? Well, I'll explain them to you. First thing you're going to do is set your camera to manual mode. Okay, now that you've done that, look at the bottom of your screen. You'll see a bunch of numbers going across. The first number is going to say 1/50, 1/250. That number is your shutter speed. If you've ever heard your shutter open and close, it's that sound inside your camera. That's your shutter opening and closing. Your camera sensor on the camera body is actually opening. When your shutter is open, you're letting in light to your camera. What shutter speed does is it captures the movement of your subject. Let's say you're doing sports photography. You're gonna want that shutter speed really high, 1/500th of a second. That means your shutter is closing 1/500th of a second. But if you're doing something like a portrait or still images, you can go down to 1/50th of a second. Just keep in mind that when you go to a lower number, that you're going to be letting in more light to your camera. So if you go on Google and you look up light trail pictures, to get those kinds of images, you're going to want a really low shutter speed, like 3 seconds. What that means is that your shutter is staying open for 3 seconds. It's not 1/3, it's just 3. So your shutter is opening for 3 seconds, getting that light into your camera. Now what that also means is that if you're getting more light, you're gonna have to compensate with your aperture or your ISO. So you're gonna have to lower one of those or raise one of them. Now that we've talked about shutter speed, let's talk about aperture. What is aperture? Aperture is controlled by your lens. What aperture does is it opens your lens to where it lets in more light and also gives you a shallower depth of field. Aperture is also known as your f-stop. It's going to be in the middle right here. That number is going to have an F right before it. Right now I have mine set at f4, which means I'm letting in light, but I'm also getting a blurrier background. Your aperture also controls your depth of field. What that means is that if you have a lower f-stop, a lower aperture, you're going to get a blurrier background, or bokeh. If it's a very dark setting, like a concert, and you want to let more light in, you can take your f-stop down. Depending on your lens, though, if you have a prime lens, like a 50mm, you can probably get down to an f-stop of 1.8. So that'll let in a ton more light. Some lenses can only go to 3.5 to 5.6 when they're fully extended. Let's say I'm at f16 and I take it down to f1.8 or f2.8. What that's gonna do, it's gonna open that lens up. If you have a manual lens, you can look into your lens and you can see it opening as you take down the aperture. That's going to let in more light, give you a shallower depth of field, and if you let in more light, you might have to compensate with a higher shutter speed or a lower ISO. So, what's an ISO? ISO is basically fake light in your camera. Your ISO is making the sensor in your camera body more sensitive to light. When you bring the ISO number up, it's going to bring more light in, but you also give yourself the chance of having more grain in your photos or your videos. The thing with ISO is I would be very careful about it, because if you go too high, you start to get some grain in your photos, and it's the little tiny weird colored pixels in the dark parts of your image, and that's not good. You don't want that. So, shutter speed controls motion, and it controls the light let through the lens. Aperture controls how wide you open your lens to let in more light, and it also controls your depth of field. And third, ISO controls the sensitivity of your sensor, making your image brighter or darker, but just think of it as artificial light. All three of those settings control your exposure triangle. Once you learn those three basics, your photography is just your skills are gonna skyrocket. I mean, you know, I learned and I wanna teach you guys now. But yeah, just start practicing. Just start flipping the numbers and learn your camera settings and figure out what dial does what. Because for the longest time, I didn't even know that there was a front dial on my camera. You know, everybody starts somewhere, and if this is my chance to do something and help people and improve my skills, then I'm gonna do it. And with that being said, I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace out, guys. Your aperture also Bleh. Let me put this out there. Let me put this out there. Let's see. Yeah. God, that's, oh my God. Ugh. I hate talking to a camera. Peace. Peace.